"How do you like England, Mr Finzi?" an innocent passer-by once politely inquired. She never forgot his furious outburst in response. The composer never forgot the wound inflicted. As we'll discover, Gerald Finzi was a sensitive man in so many ways. He was English, of course, the very model of the English country gentleman who lovingly set the words of Hardy, Wordsworth and Shakespeare. But the slightly exotic name was inescapable, inherited from his ancestors, whom he traced back to Padua. It wasn't just his nationality either. He was forever honing, revising his work, never completely confident he'd found his true voice. Finzi's sense of a place in history was elusive too. The brevity of human life was a constant preoccupation. His father died when he was only 8, and by the time he was 17, all 3 of his brothers were also dead, one of them having taken his own life. Finzi always struggled with how his contribution to music might find a place among the works of those who followed. And so, when the sweet, placid babe, as his mother remembered him in infancy, began to hunt out his musical path, it was with a head full of complex thoughts.
Call off your eyes from care by some determined deftness, put forth joys dear as excess, without the core that cloys, and charm life's lourings fair. Exultant crown the hour that girdles us, and fill it full with glee, blind glee, excelling aught could ever be, were heedfulness in power. Send up such touching strains that limitless recruits from fancy's pack shall rise.
The opening of Gerald Finzi's first published song cycle, setting his favourite poet Thomas Hardy, A Young Man's Exhortation. That song from Finzi's early 30s, but very much encapsulating the sombre thoughts about life which Finzi had even at an early age. If he'd been content to continue any of the family lines, Finzi would have turned out a businessman like his father, or reaching farther back among those Paduan antecedents who were Sephardic Jews. There were scientists, astronomers, doctors, and a grandfather who'd been a surgeon-dentist with a flair for business. He'd designed his own drill, capable of being used at all angles to his patients' mouths without inconvenience, as the explanatory notice made plain when the contraption was put on display at the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. With that background, it should be no great surprise that as an impressionable boy, Finzi had his ambitions to be a composer ignited by an unorthodox spark, quite literally. It was the spring holiday of 1913, and Master Finzi was laid up in the school sanatorium with some infectious childhood ailment. He told the nurse that after the fire in his room had gone out at night, he could see the floor glowing. He was told not to be so foolish. Soon after, the floor did indeed burst into flames, a fire having crept along the joists. He'd been right, grown-ups wrong. It's a bizarre incident, but by all accounts, the conflagration was taken by Finzi as a signal that he had a voice to be heard, and the medium he chose was musical composition. Having seen his destiny in the flaming floorboards, 2 of Finzi's early teachers had a profound influence on him. The first was Ernest Farrer in Harrogate, a genial and sympathetic young composer of the pastoralist school who'd studied with Sanford. Finzi really took to him, and even on days when he didn't have lessons, Farrer would come home to find young Gerald sitting on his garden fence, eager for more musical enlightenment or just for a walk on the moors. This was in 1914, and so their relationship was destined to be short-lived. Farrer was called up to serve with the Devonshires at the front. A replacement teacher was needed, and it was decided that Finzi should travel the 20 miles to York to have lessons from the organist at the Minster there, Edward Bairstow. The sounds of the Minster organ loft clearly stayed with Finzi throughout his life, as in this next piece, which is undoubtedly one of his greatest achievements in church music, a setting in English of the Magnificat. It was written to a commission from the USA for a college in Massachusetts for their candlelit Christmas Vespers service. It's quite possible that Finzi himself never heard the music as he intended with a church organ, because the British premiere was given at the Wigmore Hall in London, where they had to make do with a Hammond. That beautiful final Amen, a very unorthodox replacement for the more traditional Gloria normally heard after the Magnificat, and even that almost never made it. The music didn't come very easily to Finzi, and it all got to be uncomfortably close to the deadline. Finzi's son Christopher remembers his dad writing the Amen in the car on the way to the post office, already past 0 hour for the American postal delivery. Finzi's childhood wasn't by anyone's reckoning idyllic. His own memories of his boyhood years were of being solitary and unhappy. For as long as he could remember, he said, he'd always felt a stranger among his family. So even more than most of us, Finzi spent much of these years trying to sort out the right kind of social environment for himself. Typical were his quaint letters to a close female friend, Vera Strawson. "Thank you, madam, for your letter," he would often start, and sign his name with a minuscule G, even on the back of the paper sometimes, so reticent was he about his own identity. As for music, he was definitely hunting for a style of his own in the early years, and with a perceptible lack of confidence, which is at the same time utterly endearing. In his mid-20s, when he made his first attempt at an extended instrumental work, his Concerto for Small Orchestra and Solo Violin, we can hear echoes of Bach, and especially in the serene central slow movement, wafts of the English pastoral tradition he'd been brought up in, and folk song. Finzi revered Vaughan Williams. When Finzi had seen his Shepherds of the Delectable Mountains a couple of years earlier, he'd written on his programme, "One of the greatest moments of my life." He struggled massively with the first movement of this concerto, and in fact he hadn't managed to finish it in time for the first performance, which went ahead with only the other two movements. It was Vaughan Williams who urged him to have another go for a second performance early in 1928. The soloist on both occasions was Sybil Eaton. Finzi seems to have idolised her from a distance, but typically for him, never actually managed to tell her about his feelings. When it was first heard, the concerto came in for some criticism. The Daily Mail took the opportunity to swipe at Finzi as a clever young composer who takes himself too seriously and keeps his eyes too close to the music paper. On the whole, Finzi could take the musical punches on the chin, but at this formative time in his life, the questioning of his nationality in another review was too much. A namesake of his, a Signor Finzi, was prominent in Italian politics, and an unfortunate link with the composer was made. This drew a sharp riposte from R.O. Morris, and he studied counterpoint with him, who sent a letter to the Times objecting to the insolent personal comment which the paper had evidently printed. Race appears to have been a curiously sensitive issue for Finzi, and perhaps he wasn't alone in this amongst the family. In his childhood, Finzi's brother Edgar had drawn up a big chart of different styles of noses: Roman, Grecian, nosy Parkery, potato, Hebrew, and Finzi. As it happens, Finzi's own nose didn't fit into any of these stereotypes, and yet he was saddled with a name which was clearly not English. And in those years, during the First World War, living in Yorkshire, one wonders what sort of attention this family of Jewish and German-Italian ancestry might have attracted. This was a time when, in the rising tide of anti-German feeling, people threw stones at Dachshund dogs, and the first Sea Lord, Prince Louis of Battenberg, thought it politic to change his name to Mountbatten. Religion was another subject on which Finzi seems to have had somewhat contradictory views. He was an agnostic, firmly against any kind of dogma and ritual, and yet one often senses that he was strongly attached to the ideals of the Church. One of his most exquisite legacies was inspired by the concept of peace on earth. In Terra Pax weaves together the text of Robert Bridges' poem, Noel, Christmas Eve 1913, and parts of the Christmas story taken from St. Luke's Gospel. Finzi gives the poem, with its rather introspective mood, to the bass soloist, while the soprano and the chorus take the part of the angels in the biblical text. The principal characters are missing. There's no Holy Family, no Christ child. Finzi said that the Nativity becomes a vision seen by a wanderer on a dark and frosty Christmas Eve in our own familiar landscape.
But to me heard afar, it was starry music, angels' song, comforting as the comfort of Christ, when he spake tenderly to his sorrowful flock. The old words came to me by the reaches of time, mellowed and transfigured as I stood on the hill.
That music was inspired by a magical midnight moment of solitary contemplation, as the new year was ushered in by the pealing bells on Chosen Hill, looking out over Elgar's Malverns and Gurney's Gloucestershire. Afterwards, Finzi had joined the other revellers for cider and singing in the sexton's cottage. These were treasured memories for Finzi, who grew ever closer to the countryside around him as the years passed.
As I lay in the early sun, stretched in the grass, I thought upon my true love, my dear love, who has my heart forever, who is my happiness when we meet, my sorrow when we sever. Hazel fire when I do burn, gentle when I moody turn, brave when I am sad and heavy, and all laughter when I am merry.
For Gerald Finzi, a quiet afternoon in the summer sunshine, perhaps a little gardening, and of course an hour or two over the manuscripts, was the perfect way to pass the time. If the weather kept him indoors, then there'd always be happy childhood memories of having storybooks read to him by Emily, the family's maid, as he lay on the rug in front of the fire, gazing into the flames, with the perfect company of his two cats, Harold and Whisky. According to Emily, he loved his cats very dearly and found a bit of peace with them. Finzi enjoyed the simpler things of life and always loved exploring the English landscape. At the age of 18, he'd set off for the original Glastonbury Festival, the one organised by Rutland Boughton. If Finzi wasn't already a vegetarian by this time, he became one then, caught up by Boughton's passionate rural idealism, even writing to Bernard Shaw for advice on how to get hold of sandals not made of leather. He would later cast off even his animal-friendly footwear and make a barefoot walking tour of the Scillies, where he struck up a friendship with a very bright and equally intense young man, Graham Hutton. As they trudged around the islands, putting in 30 miles a day, Finzi recited Hardy's poems and sang to the seals. Apparently, they sang back. For Finzi, this was where truth was to be found in life, at one with his environment and all the miraculous creations within it. the first of Gerald Finzi's set of 7 part songs, setting words by Robert Bridges. If Finzi were alive today, he'd definitely have been adding his voice to the environmental campaign against accruing air miles. For him, the greatest pleasures didn't require a passport. They were to be found close to home, in the countryside of Berkshire, where he came to assume a position of major importance in the cultural community. Circumstances forced Finzi to spend some of his time in the capital, but only when it was absolutely necessary, when going there was the only way he could hear the music he wanted to. SW1 looks very nice, but it's a stuffy, smoky place, he told his aunt after moving in for a while. And it wasn't just the place itself. When, in 1930, he took on a job teaching a day a week at the Royal Academy of Music, in the light of his experience of the august institution, his rebellious spirit was aroused, and his acerbic sense of humour soon pricked into action as he mocked the Royal Crematorium, the theory of music, harmony, the first species, and such things about which I know nothing and care less. What a lot of taradiddle and bunkum it is. Foreign travel certainly wasn't a great attraction. Finzi made only one adult trip to Europe, Belgium and Germany, and it can't exactly have sharpened his wanderlust that among the highlights was a car crash in Dunkirk, which literally scarred him for life. So instead of the Parthenon, or perhaps the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, it was the case of the disappearing apple, which broadened Finzi's personal horizons. This was the radio talk given by the food writer Philip Morton Shand, grandfather of Camilla, Duchess of Cornwall, incidentally, which sparked Finzi's passionate, not to say obsessive devotion for the rest of his life to cultivating as many as he could of this country's once dazzling profusion of varieties of apple. Apparently his orchard eventually included 400 different kinds. It was a passion whose seeds had been sown in childhood, secretly clambering up into a neighbour's loft to examine, and surely sample too, all the freshly harvested varieties of apples. Let's pause for a stroll through Finzi's orchard now. One of his most beautiful pastoral works, an early piece, also appears to help itself to a revealing borrowing. The Severn Rhapsody incorporates a distinctive melodic motif from a George Butterworth song, a setting of A.E. Housman's poem, which begins, "Loveliest of trees, the cherry now is hung with bloom along the bough, and stands about the woodland ride, wearing white for Eastertide." Finzi's wistful piece seems to refract the image with its constantly changing rhythms, a lament for something vanished. Finzi's natural surroundings were more than just inspiration for his music. In many ways, they were his life, a relationship just like any other. And this led him to one very trenchant philosophy, namely that man is ultimately moulded by his environment, not by his DNA. Nurture over nature, in other words. This was something he saw in his own experience of growing up in a difficult family situation where he found he had next to nothing in common with the 2 surviving siblings of what had been 5 children. As he pondered this in 1938, he was quite clear in his own mind that nationality was not a matter of race and blood. It is a matter of culture, custom, and environment. Finzi's views were put to extreme test during the war, when he highlighted the nonsense of persecuting the Jews, when it was plain to him, as he said, that we're all of mixed race. The logic of what was being pursued in Germany was that we should send Vaughan Williams back to Wales, where some century or another an ancestor might have come from, or Elgar to Denmark, or Grieg to Scotland. Holst's grandfather was a political refugee. Sibelius has hardly any Finnish blood in him. In this list of putative deportees, Finzi, this Englishman with Jewish antecedents who'd come from northern Italy, could well have included himself, of course. Underlying all of this was a belief that everyone has the potential to achieve great things if only the right conditions can be found. This idea of visionary capabilities in childhood, of striving to reconnect the adult soul to the intuitive primal state of childhood, lies at the heart of the next work, Intimations of Immortality. Lines from Wordsworth's poem would have struck a deep chord with Finzi. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy, but he beholds the light, and whence it flows he sees it in his joy. The youth who daily farther from the east must travel still is nature's priest. These words spoke directly to his heart, and it irritated Finzi that some regarded his temerity in setting great poetry to music as at best gilding the lily, at worst a kind of sacrilege. He responded with typical forcefulness. This, he said, was bilge and bunkum. What mattered, first and last, was the composer's response to the poem, that he wishes to identify with it and share it. The bleak poem is certainly a challenge to set, since it's entirely reflective, with no dialogue and no dramatic narrative. But Finzi's music exquisitely, movingly, and often powerfully conveys his response to the beauties of the natural world and to the mysteries of man's existence. Out of the silence, Finzi conjures an ethereal horn call right at the start of the piece. It stands for the intimations themselves, and it returns to close the work. Throughout the intimations, the keyword joy, his wife's name, and associated words like glory, bliss, and lovely are lit in Finzi's score with a special radiance.
Thanks to its tenderness, its joys and fears, to me the meanest flower that blows can give thoughts that often lie too deep for tears.
Despite the fact that Finzi said the music had been simmering in him for 16 years, getting the score finished in time involved a frantic last-minute scramble. Amid this panic, the title on the original vocal scores was misprinted as Intimations of Immorality. There was some desperate overnight pasting work at the publishers to put that right in the copies that went on sale. Finishing the piece certainly came at a price for Finzi. His great friend Robin Milford wrote to him, "I'm not surprised the intimations took it out of you. It's a bigger work than I could conceive." It was also not long before the beginnings of the illness which would take his life.
You're listening to the podcast version of BBC Radio 3's Composer of the Week with Donald Macleod.
It's January 1939. In many ways, things couldn't be better for Finzi. His great dream, a house in the countryside built to his own specification, is just about ready to move into. The address cards have already gone out to all his friends. Church Farm, Ashmansworth, near Newbury, Berkshire. For the rest of our lives, I hope. This marked a completely fresh start for Finzi and his wife of 6 years, Joy. They sold all the furniture from their previous place, and everything for Church Farm was made anew by local craftsmen. It wasn't a beautiful house, but big and sturdy, spreading itself comfortably on the land, its brick walls pierced by a row of wide and tall windows on the ground floor. There were soon, of course, apple trees espaliered between them. All of it was made possible by some money Joy had been left by her mother, though they did have to borrow to do it in the style they wanted. Joyce Black, as she'd been when they first met, but soon, and for the rest of her life, known as Joy, was a tall, slim, dark-haired, striking-looking young woman, and just the feisty, confident, organising type Finzi needed to knock him into shape. To greet her was like kissing a hollyhock, according to one friend. Vaughan Williams saw their marriage as uncomplicated and perfect. The couple were aware of what lay around the corner. This was 1939. But for now, they wanted to make the most of what they'd achieved. Whatever comes, wrote Joy, we must never forget how happy we have been together. The Romance for Strings by Gerald Finzi, like so many pieces of his, returned to much later and rewritten. The approach of war meant more to Finzi than simply hardship. He was deeply concerned about the cultural ideals he stood for. When Germany annexed Austria, he wrote, "You must know what I feel like. It's like watching a man done to death, only this is a civilization and the last stand of Central European culture. I feel much more than ever can be said. Look at the beauty of those violets." The scale and nature of the upheaval troubled Finzi profoundly and made it virtually impossible for him to think of writing music, as so much evil was being unleashed on the world. How then can I get an inner peace to work whilst others are combating this partly for me, and when I know that if Nazism does prevail, as possibly it may do, it will be the end of our culture for centuries? At least he could assuage his guilt slightly by joining the Home Guard, but his feelings of mourning for the fate of art couldn't be easily shaken off, nor the sense that he might be losing his own best years. He felt he was just beginning to flower, just starting to do my real work. Which isn't to say he didn't achieve anything. For Vaughan Williams's 70th birthday concert in 1942, Finzi offered up a cycle of Shakespeare songs, together with the largest apple ever seen for dear Uncle Rafe. The prodigious fruit was admired, according to the recipient, for its appearance, magnitude, and taste. It fed 5,000, and there are some broken pieces left. As for his musical offering, that was entitled Let Us Garlands Bring, 5 songs from Shakespeare, starting with texts from Twelfth Night, Two Gentlemen of Verona, and then from Cymbeline, Fear No More the Heat of the Sun, which is filled with the ache of bitter regret, in spite of the comforting lullaby rhythm, and which Ursula Vaughan Williams reckoned was one of the finest songs ever written. This was, after all, Finzi's natural domain, the ephemeral, fragile nature of human life. The cycle ends with It Was a Lover and His Lass from As You Like It.
In the springtime, the only pretty ring time, when birds do sing, a ding-a-ding-a-ding, sweet lovers love the spring. And therefore take the present time, with the hey and the ho and the hey nonny no. For love is crowned with the prime in the springtime, the only pretty ring time, when birds do sing, hey ding-a-ding-a-ding, sweet lovers love the spring.
A single small cloud passes across the bright blue springtime sky of It Was a Lover and His Lass, the last song of the Shakespeare collection Let Us Garlands Bring by Gerald Finzi, composed as a wartime homage to his friend Rafe Vaughan Williams on his 70th birthday. I may so far have given the impression of a rather self-pitying, self-indulgent artist sitting around in his large house cultivating his apples a long way from danger, whilst everyone else did the fighting. But Finzi, with his Jewish ancestry, did have special anxieties about what his fate would surely be if Hitler invaded. He constructed in extremis a sort of priest's or rabbi's hole in his library behind a secret sliding panel of bookshelves. And the Finzis collectively did make some important contributions to the war effort. To the disquiet of their neighbours from the outbreak of war, they took in a collection of political refugees, beginning with a Bavarian Jew called Becky, who lost virtually her entire family in the Holocaust and who came out on the last possible train, clutching the sewing machine which she hoped would earn her a living. The Germans had smashed it to pieces at the frontier. For his part, Finzi was presented with the option of working either for the BBC or for the Ministry of War Transport. So rather than, as he put it, flounder about in something that is neither music nor organisation, he chose the latter. Finzi was actually very lucky. The pen-pushing work he was tasked with was hardly onerous, and he was surrounded by various sympathetically minded people, church organists and such. Yet he soon ended up, spiritually, totally depleted. He seems to have experienced a sense of panic that music simply wasn't coming to him anymore. In 1943, he had a complete collapse and got sent home on a month's sick leave. These then were barren years for composition. It wasn't until after the war that the creative juices began to flow again, ironically enough, at the behest of the BBC, whence came a request to compose some incidental music for a production of Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost. The deadline was scarily close. Finzi had just 3 weeks to deliver his score. "I'm not made like that," Finzi said. His gestation periods were usually measured in decades, but he sweated through it and finished the score at 4 p.m, the day before the play was due to be broadcast. Finzi later revised some of the music for an open-air performance and generously left it to any future producer to take or leave what he wants and to begin and end where he likes. Music which Finzi composed for Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost. That's one of the first works which Finzi completed after the war. As I said, during the war years, he wasn't in very good mental shape. He's been given some stick for collapsing so spectacularly, despite having one of the cushiest desk jobs going. Of course, it's impossible for us to quantify the anguish caused him by the assault he clearly experienced on the beliefs and ideology which were so absolutely fundamental to his very identity. Finzi had had to overcome his fervent pacifist beliefs to serve in the war effort. So deep was his concern for the possible impact of the Nazis on all that he cherished. This was a time when the writer and broadcaster John Amis said Finzi went around fulminating with rage at some injustice, a sort of walking Manchester Guardian. There were certainly some agonizing contradictions. Finzi had always believed in nurture rather than nature as the moulder of human beings, and yet he seriously suggested that biologists needed to find a way of identifying rampant cells in the likes of Hitler so that the individuals could be done away with in youth. But somehow Finzi managed in the end to reconcile the paradoxes in his mind, not least when it came to religion. As I said, he was ardently anti-dogma, yet he composed overtly religious music and encouraged his children to explore all the religions, though with a marked preference for the Quakers. Finzi compared his role to that of Da Vinci, a non-religious man bringing revelation to people through his Last Supper. An outstanding work of Finzi's from just after the war is a fine demonstration of his approach to religious music. The anthem, Lo, the Full Final Sacrifice, was a commission for the Chichester Festival in 1946 from the Reverend Walter Hussey, vicar of St Matthew's Church, Northampton, an enlightened and cultured cleric who had a mission to bring about a closer connection between the church and the arts. It was Hussey who proposed the theme of the Eucharist, and what began in Finzi's mind as only a little thing grew into the largest span of music he'd composed up to that time, as the music came to take the outline of the drama of the Eucharist, contemplated from afar at the beginning, reverently approached and solemnly enacted, taking up first the bread and then the wine. For his text, Finzi was drawn to the passionate language and the mystical atmosphere of the 17th century metaphysical poets. He chose to set Richard Crashaw's Hymn for the Blessed Sacrament, a translation of 2 Latin poems by St. Thomas Aquinas. The passion and the ecstasy are already there in the text, so Finzi characteristically doesn't set out to paint the words, but to draw his music out from them. The atmosphere is restrained and hushed, mysterious and awed. Lo, the Full Final Sacrifice by Gerald Finzi. Although the war was over by the time Finzi composed that piece in 1946, things still weren't easy, but Finzi's attitudes seem to have softened a good deal. Food was certainly in short supply, and the whole nation was exhausted. Finzi himself in a moth-eaten state with a cough and spending hours on some ridiculous household job. But then, as he said, one thinks of all we've come through to be here at all. The only survivor out of millions of spermatozoa, then one of the infants of children who didn't die. Then we escaped being one of the millions who were killed or died as a result of the Nazis. And after all that, we get in a frenzy because a plug won't pull, or a man hammers a nail in, or a pencil mislaid. For any composer, any artist for that matter, the creative process is all too often a halting one, less a firework display than a smouldering burn. For every breakthrough, there are likely to be many more setbacks and times when things just don't go quite right. Finzi was definitely no exception. In fact, the landscape of his compositional career is strewn with the burned-out hulks of works abandoned before they were completed, but typically often returned to in later years, much to the consternation of all those who've attempted to catalogue, date, and generally rationalise his work. Redrafting seems to have been an early trait and indicative of Finzi's ever-thoughtful approach to life. In 1923, he got a reply to a letter he'd written to Vaughan Williams. He not only annotated this reply with his own further comments, he even went back at some subsequent point and amended his annotations. And so to a new character in Finzi's life story, Dave. Dave was a projected piano concerto, which was so christened by Finzi's friend, the composer Howard Ferguson, who would write to him inquiring about progress on the concerto by asking, "How's Dave?" This was a reference to the biblical David, the plucky shepherd boy slayer of the giant Philistine Goliath, a significant symbolic victory for Finzi. The whole thing never came off, although characteristically Finzi kept going back to it over a period of almost a quarter of a century. One of the byproducts was this beautiful slow movement, which was published posthumously by Finzi's sons as this serene eclogue. Composition was all too often a struggle for Finzi, and his critical tendencies weren't confined to his own work. In 1928, he'd been to visit a prototype work of Vaughan Williams, The Fat Knight, later to become Sir John in Love. Finzi's reaction was to write, "What I heard of The Fat Knight contained the worst music Vaughan Williams has ever written." He was prepared to admit, however, it goes with great pace and has certain new rhythmical developments as far as he's concerned. And Finzi was witheringly condescending about the music of Noel Coward, and when he went to hear the brilliant jazz pianist and composer whom he referred to as the Duke of Ellington, he was lucky to get away with "far too dazzling for my slow mind." Another opportunity for debate was Vaughan Williams's 70th birthday. Several of the old man's pupils wrote celebratory pieces, but when Finzi heard them broadcast on the BBC, he was scathing in his assessment of their worth. Lambert's work was balls, and Alan Bush's ghastly. The works by Patrick Hadley and Gordon Jacob didn't go down much better. At least the Rubra and McConkie seemed to have got a tick. Poulenc was another composer who generally failed to impress, roundly dismissed as piffle. Yet at least one movement of Finzi's own set of bagatelles, the Prelude, makes a distinct nod in his direction. These 5 pieces for clarinet and piano are another instance of Finzi's constant chipping away over the years. Although Finzi wrote the final bagatelle in the summer of 1943, he'd begun these miniatures back in the 1920s. Only one movement was new, the rest was all cobbled together from 20-year-old bits and pieces. It's amazing, given their long history, that this is one of his freshest and most fluent works. In the end, the bagatelles turned out to be some of the most successful music Finzi ever composed, but here again he was perhaps predictably dismissive of this too. They're only trifles. I'm sure Gordon Jacob could have done just as well in a fraction of the time. Also characteristic of Finzi is the fact that the majority of the music is slow, a series of 3 movements called Romance, Carol and Forlana, framed by that delightfully ingratiating prelude and a final vigorous fugetta. At this distance, Finzi can sometimes come over as deeply earnest and not a little superior and aloof, but music like that reminds us of the warmth of the man and the fact that he obviously had a great sense of humour. Finzi's reactions could be surprising, and it sometimes seemed that he was never satisfied. When the edition of the bagatelles sold out within a year, he was actually annoyed about it, thinking their popularity outweighed the piece's worth. The business of trying to rework and reuse old material, as he did in the bagatelles, seems to have got Finzi into some hot compositional water. His great friend Howard Ferguson eventually lost patience with him over the protracted reworkings of the material of the piano concerto after Finzi tried to salvage it by digging out some old tunes to put in. "I can see no harm in using up self-contained slabs of old stuff," Ferguson wrote to him, "provided they're not mixed up with stuff of a much later vintage. When there is such a mixture, difficulties start crowding in." Fortunately, Ferguson regained his cool at some point, as he took on the distinctly unenviable task of editing Finzi's work after his death. This was marginally less of a headache than might otherwise have been the case, since, with typical scrupulousness, Finzi had helped everyone out considerably by putting together an opus number catalogue which included gaps for projected works. Another piece which never quite saw the light of day in full was Finzi's planned equivalent of the Seasons, which he called The Bud, the Blossom and the Berry. The last movement has become the best known, The Fall of the Leaf, which he fiddled with endlessly during his life. But we'll hear what he intended as the first movement, this prelude with its characteristic Finzi, elegiac English pastoral mood. A sketch for an English Four Seasons there, in the prelude which was salvaged from an abandoned work after Finzi's death. Finzi was, of course, acutely aware of his Englishness throughout his life, and that interest manifested itself in some unexpected ways. In particular, he was a budding musicologist in his spare time, fascinated by the music of the English 18th century composers Arne, Avison, Boyce, Rosengrave, and especially John Stanley. Finzi made new performing editions of their works with notes that reveal up-to-date attitudes to performance practice, and even earned himself a footnote in the article on Stanley in the 1954 edition of Grove's Dictionary of Music, thanks to some redating work he'd been doing. Also notable was a talk he gave to the Royal Musical Association about Stanley in 1951 in support of his conviction that all sectors of musical culture deserved attention. He supported minor composers just as he supported amateur music making. Arne, Boyce and Avison may not any one of them have been the equal of Handel, but as Finzi was often wont to quote, "If he cannot bring a cedar, let him bring a shrub." Sadly, Finzi's pleadings for these relatively obscure composers sometimes fell on deaf ears. He was desperate to provide Arne editions for Musica Britannica, the great national collected edition of the classics of this country's music, which was launched at the time of the Festival of Britain, but they turned him down. It's a delicious irony that Finzi took such pleasure in pinning down the precise chronology of works by his English forebears when he himself has given those who've studied his work such a steep mountain to climb. One of the longest gestations for any of his pieces was his cello concerto, which was in progress intermittently between 1930 and 1955. The impulse to complete it came with a request from Sir John Barbirolli for a major work for the Halley Orchestra to perform for what would be his 10th Cheltenham Festival, which fell in 1955. A lot of the work had already been done by then. From the very beginning, there's a sense of a new direction in Finzi's music, a power and drama that for many people may be lacking elsewhere. There's a brooding Celtic cast to the opening theme of the first movement with its Scotch snap, which Stephen Banfield has suggested may be linked to memories of a holiday the Finzi spent in the west of Scotland the previous year. We'll hear this expansive movement now, its mood one of troubled, sometimes anguished melancholy, with passages of dissonance which suggest torment or rage. The finest score you've yet written. So Sir Arthur Bliss told Gerald Finzi of the cello concerto he composed, or rather completed, in 1955. But the premiere of the concerto at that year's Cheltenham Festival came in what were to be unhappy times for the Finzis. Gerald's mother was now 90 and in a nursing home. She was delighted to read the press notices for the concerto and had said, "I'm so happy I really want to die." Not long after, she passed away. Joy Finzi remembered her fondly and perceptively. Though she was a simple and rather silly little woman, in whom lifelong deafness and a fundamental lack of brain had created permanent illusions about everything, Gerald always owed a deep debt of gratitude to her for having made him independent in a small way. If 1955 ended gloomily, 1956 was to see the illness which would take Finzi's life produce a steep decline in his health.
The first fire since the summer is lit and is smoking into the room. The sun rays thread it through like wolf lines in a loom. Sparrows spurt from the hedge, whom misgivings appall, that winter did not leave last year forever after all.
This is the podcast version of BBC Radio 3's Composer of the Week, your guide to a composer's life and work with Donald Macleod.
Little head against my shoulder, shy at first, then somewhat bolder, and abide till she, with a timid quaver, yielded to the kiss I gave her. But she sighed, that there mingled with her feeling some sad thought she was concealing. It implied not that she had ceased to love me, none on earth she set above me, but she sighed.
Few artists have ever been so acutely aware of the transience of youth and the brevity of our earthly life as Gerald Finzi. If he'd ever believed in such a thing, he'd surely have felt that he'd been touched by the hand of fate, and the fact that he should have died young, in his mid-50s, the only way things could have been. That setting of Thomas Hardy's poem, The Sigh, captures an absolutely characteristic Finzi mood, melancholy, English, pastoral, with a sense of loss, and in this case, the shadow of death. I'm looking at a picture of Finzi with his brothers and sisters, the five of them arranged for the photographer like perfectly ascending organ pipes. By the end of the First World War, when Finzi was 17, only the tallest and the shortest, his sister and himself, had survived. Their father had died when Finzi was only 8. It was through these experiences that Finzi came to idealise life, particularly the fleeting years of youth, and to lament its decline so much. When he and his wife Joy built their new house on the Hampshire Downs, Finzi eagerly buried a time capsule in the garden, which contained a copy of one of his own songs and some of his favourite poems, which of course included some by Thomas Hardy. With his cast of mind, the passage from an old year into the new was a time which always brought mixed emotions. Finzi loved the occasion, but it also saddened him. In 1926, in his mid-20s, he composed a piece called his New Year music. Finzi's New Year's Eve isn't about rumbustious celebration and rousing toasts or singing Auld Lang Syne, arm linked in arm. As his biographer Diana McVeigh has put it, his New Year music creates a desolate, introspective soundscape. the harp suggesting the ticking away of a clock or the trickling of the sands of time towards the end of Finzi's nocturne New Year music. It would probably be fair to say, and we've heard it in his music, that Finzi was a natural pessimist. He took the line with his great friend, the composer Howard Ferguson, that all thoughts have already been thought, the rest is splitting of hairs. Ferguson, whose disposition was much sunnier, tried to josh him out of this by saying that if that were true, then all music would already have been written, and there'd be no point in any of them composing anything more. Finzi's response was to challenge him with, "You really believe that everything in the world is for the best?" When Ferguson answered yes, Finzi dissolved in laughter. But despite this rather depressing view of the futility of all human endeavour, and despite having no religious faith, Finzi did compose pieces with a positive outlook. In 1953, Finzi had a commission from the BBC's religious department, apparently for inclusion in a choral evensong broadcast. That's certainly the context in which Welcome, Sweet and Sacred Feast was broadcast later in October of that year. It's a setting of words by one of Finzi's beloved metaphysical poets, Henry Vaughan. The poem is a prayer of thanks for the promise of the afterlife, to Christ for his physical suffering on behalf of mankind upon the cross, and for his institution of the symbolic offering of his body to sustain believers in the sacrament of Eucharist. It begins with a short organ introduction, and the same music returns almost at the end to set the words, "O Rose of Sharon, O Lily of the Valley." Thoughts on the Afterlife from Henry Vaughan, as set by Gerald Finzi in the anthem Welcome, Sweet and Sacred Feast. 2 years before he composed that music, in 1951, Finzi sensed that his time was nearly up. He'd long kept a black book for recording what he'd done on behalf of neglected composers, including his beloved 18th century men, Stanley, Rosengrave and co. And of course there was a precise catalogue of all the dying out apple breeds he was trying to rescue from extinction. But now he began to catalogue himself. I don't mean his musical works, that task was already undertaken. This was a catalogue of his place in the world, including his family, with 37 pages, each headed with a bold Roman numeral. Most of the pages are blank, and some of them have been cut out altogether. Page 1 records some information about his father. Page 4 has some notes on his sister Kate, observed with his merciless gimlet eye. He admits to little interest in her, since she's one of those who care only for the appearance of things, as distinct from himself, who cares for the thing itself. In between these, on the second page, with all the characteristic evidence of Finzi's second thoughts, alterations and additions, are some notes about what it was that had prompted this wish to record, his illness. It had begun as a little lump on the back of his neck, which he'd put up with for more than a year. Then his glands had suddenly begun to swell up. When he consulted doctors, the news was bad. His condition was diagnosed as lymphoid follicular reticulosis, a cancer of the lymph nodes. Finzi records the exchange with his doctor once the results of the biopsy were known. Finzi: I should like to know the truth. Is it serious? Doctor: It's bad, but not the worst. Finzi: Would my life be insurable? Doctor: No. Finzi: Did you give me 5 years? Doctor: Possibly. At the very most, 10. In fact, it was to be 5. We're going to hear now the work which defines Finzi's attitude to the glories of youth, something he returned to throughout his life. Dies Natalis is one of his most intensely personal scores, and it sets words by another 17th century metaphysical poet, Thomas Traherne, which convey the awe and wonder of a child's unclouded vision of the beauty of the world. What Finzi created around the verses is a 20th century equivalent of a Baroque cantata. The purely instrumental introduction conveys an image of the unborn child in the womb. The child's rhapsodic response to the world it's just entered is followed by a swirling dance Finzi called the Rapture. He had two images in mind as he composed the music. He said, the ring of dancing angels hovering over the cowshed in Botticelli's painting of the mystic nativity, and the sight of the hundreds of carved angels, static for very ecstasy, of the wooden double hammer-beam roof of March Church in the Fens. The subsequent sections are called Wonder and the Salutation. Finzi presents his and Traherne's romantic vision of the child in all its joy and innocence, in music of burning intensity. Yet, as Diana McVeigh points out, it's neither sensual nor coy.
Will you see the infancy of this sublime and celestial greatness? I was a stranger, which at my entrance into the world was saluted and surrounded with innumerable joys. My knowledge was divine. I was entertained like an angel with the works of God in their splendor and glory.
With so much of his life spent musing on mortality, perhaps Finzi was better prepared for his own end than the majority of us. He certainly dealt with his illness with an air of calm resignation. Typical was his reaction to a letter that was sent to him by mistake in 1954. It was from his consultant, and it should have been sent to his doctor. It described his condition as going downhill very rapidly. Rather than make a fuss, Finzi simply destroyed the letter, concerned that the secretary who'd addressed it wrongly might find herself in trouble if the mistake were discovered. The end itself had a bleak irony about it. It wasn't the cancer which killed him, but a disease of childhood. The Finzis had been to Gloucester for what he called one of the happiest 3 choirs we've ever had. For old time's sake, they took Ralph and Ursula Vaughan Williams with them to visit his beloved Chosen Hill, with its happy memories of a long-distant night when Finzi had stood there and heard the village bells ring in the new year. The churchwarden invited them all into his cottage, although he warned them one of his children had chickenpox. Finzi had forgotten he'd never had the disease. His body, so weakened by then, couldn't cope, and the infection spread to his brain. This was what killed him. I'll end with a song which seems perfectly to encapsulate Finzi's attitude to his own short existence, prefacing it with his own words on the subject. At the start of his illness, he'd added a little to the introduction he'd written to his own catalogue of works. Absalom's Place, he called it. It is likely that new ideas, new fashions, and the pressing forward of new generations will soon obliterate my small contribution. Yet I like to think that in each generation may be found a few responsive minds, and for them I should still like the work to be available. To shake hands with a good friend over the centuries is a pleasant thing, and the affection which an individual may retain after his departure is perhaps the only thing which guarantees an ultimate life to his work. In 1954, Finzi wrote to a friend, "In the end, we all come down to born, works, died, and that's about all that's needed."
Yet is warmth declining, and still the day seems to say, so you audem summer dressed, of all the daughter she bethought her. not much, and yet the best she could within the too short time granted her pride.
You'll find all the gen about what we've played on the Composer of the Week page of the website at bbc.co.uk/Radio3. From me, Donald Macleod, for now, goodbye.